It was a brilliant political maneuver. By leasing rather than selling the British the equipment, he avoided a congressional vote of authorization he might well have lost. Roosevelt was well aware of the political risk of tying his presidency to the British cause. He needed reassurance that Winston Churchill was the right man to carry both their burdens.
Roosevelt could not be sure what all those stirring and wonderful speeches that unto this hour give us goose flesh might have just been classic Churchillian bombast on the road to disaster.
The task of assessing Churchill was given to Harry Hopkins, a close friend of the president, but a man with no diplomatic or foreign policy experience. On Thursday, January 9th, 1941, Hopkins arrived in London. Churchill was alarmed. All he knew was that this presidential emissary was a social worker from Iowa.
Winston was trying to ingratiate himself with his guest and saying, of course, after the war, we will modernize our cottages and we will put in electricity and plumbing. And Harry Hopkins looked at the Prime Minister and said, Mr. Prime Minister, I don't give a damn about your cottages. I have come over here to find out how we can help you beat this fella Hitler. And Churchill got up from the table and said, Mr. Hopkins, come with me.
After a month, Hopkins left Britain convinced that under Churchill's leadership the country could survive, and with American help, could prevail. The trip transformed Hopkins' role as Roosevelt's closest advisor. FDR asked him to come live at the White House and concentrate all his energy on preparing America for war. Hopkins' initial task was to convince a reluctant Congress that Britain could not be allowed to fall. On March 11, 1941, House Resolution 1776 passed. In a White House ceremony that evening, Franklin Roosevelt signed Lend-Lease into law. But this political victory would be tempered by the continued assault on London and by the growing certainty that American boys would eventually be fighting in this war. As the pressures on Roosevelt grew, the president complained he was having trouble sleeping, that his chronic sinus infection had returned. The antidote was an escape from Washington to his beloved retreat along the Hudson River. His home in Hyde Park, New York, was the spot where he could escape the public glare, relax among friends, and drop the deception of mobility that he was convinced was essential to ensure his political viability. No press was allowed. These rare home movies taken by a family friend weren't released until after his death. Increasingly, as the pressures of the war mounted, this place became a world apart, his refuge from the storm. Missy LeHand, FDR's personal assistant and constant companion, joined him on these trips. She had been with him for more than 20 years during all the struggles that followed the onset of polio. She was Roosevelt's anchor, a woman who was willing to serve with total and complete devotion.
She gave him, in a certain sense, the courage to keep going on when he was struggling to learn to walk again. It was she who watched him as he tried unsuccessfully to walk across a room with the sweat coming down from his face. And when Eleanor was out doing his political duties, Missy was really the companion who'd been with him.
On the evening of June 4th, 1941, she was at Roosevelt's side in the White House. When he left the room to retire for the night, she suddenly screamed and fell to the floor unconscious. Missy, who was only 43 years old, had suffered a stroke and spent the remaining 3 years of her life a prisoner in her own body.
The stroke that took Missy away from Roosevelt was really a disaster for Roosevelt's life. Here was this woman he depended on from the moment he waked up till the moment he went to bed at night, and suddenly she was gone from him.
I think it pushed FDR into a loneliness which he had not previously experienced.
Initially, he would go to her room on the 3rd floor of the White House and sit for hours at her bedside. But as she struggled to respond, he withdrew. Some around Roosevelt felt the president had abandoned a friend. Harold Ickes, the Secretary of the Interior, wrote in his diary, "I have lost my affection for him. Despite his very pleasant personality, he is as cold as ice inside. Missy could pass from this life, and he wouldn't even miss her."
But in fact, his actions belied what they thought was indifference, because he actually went at this period of time to his legal advisor, Basil O'Connor, and he told him he wanted to change his will so that half of his entire estate would go to take care of Missy LeHand, knowing that she might need it in her condition for the rest of her life. And O'Connor thought, oh my God, you can't do this. That means taking your own children out of your will.
I can remember my uncles were pretty horrified when they heard that their portion of the estate had been set aside and Missy would get the income. And FDR, I think at the time, commented that my sons can get along perfectly well. I don't think this is the action of an unfeeling man, because this was a very substantial act of caring.
But world events would give Roosevelt little time to agonize over the pain of losing Missy's companionship. In the summer of '41, the thunder of European guns seemed to be growing ever louder. On June 22nd, Germany surprised the world and turned against its Soviet ally. Hitler attacked along an 1,800-mile front from the Baltic to the Black Sea. In just 1 week, the Germans took 150,000 Russian prisoners, destroyed 1,200 tanks, and within a month, Hitler's forces were within sight of Leningrad and the Soviet capital.
He was at the gates of Moscow. He had tremendous power, and if the Soviet Union were defeated, then he would have a tremendous army which could be flung back against Britain, and he would also have extra raw material resources. He'd have the oil of Romania at Ploiești, he'd have the oil of the Soviet Caucasus at Grozny, what's now Chechnya. So helping the Soviet Union became the Allied imperative.
But how? Roosevelt was convinced he needed to develop a personal relationship with Churchill to devise a common, unified strategy to defeat Hitler. In early August 1941, Churchill set sail for the New World. From the bridge of the battleship HMS Prince of Wales, Churchill knew the next week might well decide the outcome of this war.
Churchill always believed, if only I can get to know him, if I can somehow find out who he is and what makes him tick, then we can have a real relationship. So this trip over was really a moment of great excitement, probably some apprehension, but Churchill's enthusiasm at meeting Roosevelt was intense.
Sailing on the USS Augusta, Roosevelt traveled north through U-boat-infested waters towards his rendezvous point with Churchill at Placentia Bay, Newfoundland. Roosevelt had long been the architect of his own foreign policy. Now he was heading towards the conference without even notifying Cordell Hull, his Secretary of State. It would not be the first or last slight he would hand his most senior cabinet officer. On August 9, 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill finally met face to face. For 3 days, the leaders alternated meetings aboard the two warships.
He was very struck by Roosevelt's courage and fortitude. The fact that Roosevelt made such an effort, I mean an incredible physical effort to go from ship to ship and to even stand unaided on the quarterdeck at the meeting. It meant a lot to Churchill.
The conference produced the first joint declaration of the war. Churchill, so determined to ingratiate himself with his new ally, reluctantly signed what became known as the Atlantic Charter, a document that promised liberation for nations struggling under the yoke of Western colonialism. It was a direct attack on the British Empire.
The British almost gagged. I mean, they just thought it was all a bunch of nonsense and hoopla and silliness, and they needed tanks, they needed planes, they needed soldiers, and there's Roosevelt talking about freedoms and democracy and all these abstractions.
The Prime Minister reluctantly went along, rationalizing that without American help, there would be no empire to defend. On August 10th, Churchill choreographed